The ridge burned with firelight as tracer rounds clawed through the night sky, red and green lines slashing across the darkness like a storm of deadly comets. The platoon was pinned, pressed against the jagged rocks of the valley floor, their ears deafened by the relentless hammering of enemy machine guns above. Dust and shards of stone erupted with every impact, pelting their faces, mixing with sweat and blood. Sergeant McKenna forced his breath steady as he counted what little ammunition they had left, each magazine lighter than the one before. They had walked straight into an ambush. The enemy had been waiting, dug in on the cliffs, hundreds of rifles and heavy weapons raining death on the small American unit caught below. The radio crackled with static, the desperate voice of Corporal Diaz trying to raise command for support, but the signal was drowned by interference, the canyon walls swallowing every word. They were cut off. The only thing louder than the gunfire was the pounding of their hearts. McKenna crawled along the rocks toward Lieutenant Hale, who crouched low behind a shattered boulder, blood soaking through his sleeve where a round had grazed him. The young officer's jaw was set, his eyes blazing with stubborn defiance even as he tried to wrap a bandage around his arm. "We can't hold this position," McKenna growled over the chaos. Hale shook his head. "We hold until I say otherwise. If we move now, we'll be slaughtered." His words were iron, but his gaze betrayed the truth. They were outnumbered at least 10-1, the enemy controlling every vantage point above. They were trapped in the valley, nowhere to go but forward or back into more gunfire. Mortar rounds began thudding into the earth nearby, the concussive blasts lifting dirt and bodies into the air. The enemy was tightening the noose, driving them toward annihilation. McKenna wanted to argue, wanted to curse the madness of staying, but he clenched his teeth and nodded. Orders were orders, and men trusted him to follow them. Private Jennings screamed as shrapnel tore across his leg, and McKenna dragged him back, pressing a tourniquet tight. Jennings sobbed, trying to push himself upright to fight again, but McKenna slammed him down. "Stay down, soldier. You'll get your chance when I say." He shoved his last grenade into the dirt beside him, ready to hurl it when the enemy pushed closer. Overhead, muzzle flashes erupted like fireworks along the ridgeline, enemy fighters shouting, their voices echoing through the valley with a cruel confidence. They knew they had the Americans surrounded. Every second was a countdown, every heartbeat louder than the last. Hale barked over the gunfire, calling for covering fire, and the men responded with what little they had left, rifles cracking, bullets streaking upward in defiance. Sparks danced along the rocks as return fire sliced down. A bullet clipped Diaz's radio, the device sparking before dying completely. Hope of air support faded into silence. They were alone, forgotten in the dark valley, fighting for every breath. Then came the lull, the kind of eerie silence that made every soldier's stomach twist. The enemy had stopped shooting for a moment, only the crackle of flames and distant echoes lingering. It was the silence of predators circling, ready to strike all at once. McKenna's hands tightened on his rifle, his knuckles pale beneath the grime. Hale's lips pressed thin. He knew it too. They were waiting, gathering for the final push, the wave that would sweep down and drown the platoon. The silence shattered when a voice cried out in a foreign tongue from above, and suddenly the ridges erupted again with gunfire, heavier and closer than before. Figures began moving, shadows against the moonlit cliffs, descending like a flood. McKenna fired until his rifle clicked empty, then shoved in his last magazine, heart hammering as he shouted for the others to stand their ground. Jennings, pale with pain, still managed to fire bursts from his rifle, teeth clenched against agony. Diaz hurled the last of the smoke grenades, trying to buy them cover, but the wind carried it away too quickly. They were being overrun and everyone knew it. And then, through the choking dust and the screaming chaos, came a sound so deep and thunderous it cut through everything, the distant chop of rotor blades. At first, McKenna thought it was his imagination, the desperate hope of a drowning man. But then the sound grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls, a steady rhythmic beat that rattled the ground beneath them. The men froze, half in disbelief, half in awe. The enemy fighters faltered too, their advance slowing as every eye turned skyward. From the shadows of the valley's far end, where the moonlight could not quite reach, a hulking shape emerged, black, sleek, and menacing. Its rotors carved the air with fury, its nose angled downward like the face of a predator. An AH-64 Apache gunship slid into view, hugging the low ground, its silhouette glowing with menace against the smoke. The platoon's despair cracked into a spark of hope, and McKenna's lips twisted into a grin he couldn't suppress. Salvation had come, wrapped in steel and fire. The Apache drifted forward like a phantom, its engines growling, cannons swiveling with mechanical hunger. For a heartbeat, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. The enemy fighters froze in their positions, stunned by the sudden arrival of death from above. The crew inside the gunship had seen the trap, had seen the ambush unfolding. Now the hunters had become the hunted. McKenna shouted with renewed strength, voice raw with relief. "That's ours, boys. That's ours." The men erupted in ragged cheers, their voices drowned by the rising scream of the Apache's engines. The gunship tilted, hovering menacingly before its cannon roared to life. A stream of fire spat downward, tearing into the ridgeline with terrifying precision. Explosions rippled across the rocks, enemy bodies flung into the air as the valley lit up with chaos once more. But this time the chaos belonged to the Americans. The roar of the Apache's cannon was like thunder rolling through the valley, shaking the ground with every burst. Enemy fighters scattered in panic, their confident chants turning into screams as the explosive rounds tore apart their fortified positions. The ridgeline that had moments ago seemed invincible now erupted with fire and debris, rocks collapsing, rifles tumbling from shattered hands. McKenna ducked as fragments rained down, but for the first time since the ambush began, he felt his chest loosen. The Apache swept across the valley like a hawk diving on prey, its Hellfire missiles streaking out in white-hot flashes before slamming into the cliffs. The blasts lit up the night, sending shockwaves rolling across the canyon walls. Men who had been firing with smug certainty were now silhouettes running desperately for cover, their formations broken, their advantage crushed in seconds. The sound of rotor blades filled the valley, a relentless drumbeat of power that smothered fear and replaced it with a savage kind of hope. Lieutenant Hale pushed himself to his feet despite the blood soaking his bandage, raising his voice above the chaos. "Hold your fire. Let her work." His words rang clear, and the soldiers obeyed, conserving their last rounds as they watched the gunship carve a path of destruction. McKenna's eyes locked on the cockpit, and he realized with a start who was piloting it. He had heard rumors, stories whispered among units about a fearless Apache pilot who flew like the machine was an extension of her soul. They called her Viper, a woman whose calm in combat was matched only by her ruthlessness. And now, here she was, emerging from the shadows of the valley like some avenging spirit, turning the tide of a battle that had already been lost. The platoon watched in stunned awe as she guided the gunship lower, skimming the canyon edge so close the rotor wash whipped dust into violent clouds. The enemy tried to rally, heavy machine guns spitting streams of fire skyward, but the Apache shrugged it off. Viper pivoted with brutal grace, unleashing counterfire so precise it seemed impossible. The 30mm chain gun tracked each muzzle flash, silencing them in seconds. One by one the enemy's strongholds crumbled, their positions shredded into burning husks. McKenna felt his throat tighten with something he hadn't dared to feel in hours: gratitude. He slammed Jennings on the shoulder, shouting over the noise. "That's her kid. That's Viper. You're gonna tell your grandkids you saw this day." Jennings, pale but grinning through the pain, laughed hoarsely, eyes shining with disbelief. Even Diaz, clutching his ruined radio, stared upward as though watching a legend take form right before him. But the fight wasn't over. The enemy wasn't just numerous, they were determined. More fighters poured from hidden caves carved into the cliffs, RPGs glinting on their shoulders. A rocket streaked toward the Apache, trailing fire. McKenna's heart froze, but Viper was faster. She rolled the gunship sideways, the rocket screaming past harmlessly before detonating against the far wall of the canyon. Without missing a beat, she swung back around, her hellfire locking on and obliterating the cave mouth in a single strike. The explosion sent a shockwave so strong McKenna had to shield his face. The ridgeline cracked, collapsing in a thunderous landslide that buried those who had been preparing their counterattack. Still, others pressed forward, trying to swarm the valley floor with sheer numbers, desperate to crush the Americans before the gunship could finish them. Hale raised his rifle again, shouting, "Now! Give her support!" The platoon roared back to life, their remaining rounds fired in furious defiance. Smoke filled the valley, muzzle flashes flickering like fireflies. McKenna hurled his grenade into the oncoming wave, the blast throwing bodies into the air. The enemy stumbled, momentum breaking just as the Apache swooped low, its cannon roaring again, ripping through the assault line with savage precision. Men who had been seconds away from overrunning the platoon now lay scattered in ruins. The battlefield had transformed in less than 5 minutes, from certain death to the raw taste of survival. Still, McKenna knew the danger wasn't gone. He could see more movement higher up the cliffs, shadowy figures regrouping. "They're not finished," he muttered, grim determination settling in. "Not yet." The gunship pulled up briefly, circling above the canyon as though surveying the damage, then dipped low again. Its spotlight blazed, cutting through the smoke, casting long shadows of broken rifles and twisted bodies. For a heartbeat, the valley seemed unreal, a place caught between nightmare and salvation. Viper's voice finally cracked through the static on the platoon's backup comms, her tone calm, clipped, professional. "This is Viper. Sit tight. I've got eyes on you. You're not dying tonight." McKenna nearly laughed at the absurdity of her composure, but he could hear the steel in her voice. She meant every word. Hale straightened, bloodied but unbroken, his eyes blazing with renewed fire. "You heard her, boys? We're not done. Lock and load what you've got left." The men reloaded with trembling hands, checking each other, dragging the wounded into tighter formation. For the first time, their fear no longer controlled them. McKenna caught himself glancing up again and again at the Apache, the hulking beast circling protectively above. The enemy had thought they were hunters, circling helpless prey. But now, with Viper overhead, they were the ones being stalked. The balance had shifted, and McKenna felt the momentum surging through every man beside him. They had been surrounded and outnumbered, but now they had a shadow on their side, a beast of fire and steel, flown by a woman who refused to let them fall. The valley was no longer their grave. It was becoming their battleground, and with Viper above, they finally had the weapon to fight back. The valley smoldered with smoke and fire, the air thick with the metallic sting of gunpowder and the acrid burn of shattered explosives. McKenna's lungs rasped as he sucked in the toxic haze, blinking against the grit that clung to his eyes. Around him, the platoon reloaded, adjusted their positions and steadied themselves, their exhaustion masked by adrenaline that screamed through every vein. Above them, the Apache circled like a predator, its blades chopping the night into shards of sound. The enemy had been torn apart in minutes, their ambush ripped to pieces by Viper's precision strikes, but McKenna knew better than to believe it was finished. These fighters weren't cowards, they were zealots who believed in dying where they stood. And zealots didn't surrender, they regrouped. His instincts told him another storm was coming, and it was going to be worse than before. Lieutenant Hale crouched beside McKenna, his wounded arm stiff but his voice steady. "We can't stay in this kill box," he said, eyes scanning the cliffs. "They'll keep pouring men down on us until they smother us." McKenna nodded grimly. "Agreed. We need high ground." Hale's gaze flicked to the ridgeline where moments ago enemy fire had poured down like rain. Now it was a mess of broken rock, bodies and smoking craters. "Up there," Hale said, pointing to a jagged path that wound toward the eastern cliff. "If we can hold that slope, the Apache can cover us. Down here we're just targets." McKenna didn't like it. The path was narrow, exposed, and if the enemy anticipated the move, they'd be picked off like fish in a barrel. But Hale was right. Staying at the bottom of the valley meant eventual annihilation. "All right," McKenna said, rallying the men. "We move on my mark. Stay tight, stay low. Cover each other." The soldiers nodded, their faces streaked with grime but their eyes burning with renewed will. As they began their push toward the slope, the enemy reappeared. Shadows darted among the rocks above, rifles flashing, voices rising in furious cries. Bullets sparked against the stones as the platoon scrambled upward, dragging their wounded with them. Jennings hobbled on one leg, supported by Diaz, both men firing short bursts as they climbed. The Apache swooped lower, its cannon opening fire again, carving apart the enemy positions that threatened to overrun the ascent. Explosions ripped through the cliffside, shaking the path with violent tremors. Rocks tumbled downward, forcing the men to shield their heads as they pressed on. McKenna fired upward, his shots finding a figure crouched behind a ledge, the man's body crumpling before tumbling into the darkness below. "Keep moving," he shouted, his throat raw. The enemy's strategy was clear now: choke the Americans on the slope, trap them between fire from above and below. But Viper seemed to anticipate every move, her gunship hovering dangerously close to the rock face, delivering punishment with surgical precision. For every man that fell, 3 more appeared, climbing out from hidden caves and tunnels. They fired RPGs wildly, one streaking past the Apache close enough to rattle its frame. Viper banked sharply, rotor wash slamming dust across the platoon, before retaliating with another missile. The blast tore open a cavern entrance, collapsing it in a thunderous roar that swallowed fighters whole. Still, the pressure mounted. The Americans scrambled higher, sweat slicking their bodies, legs trembling under the weight of gear, exhaustion clawing at their resolve. McKenna grabbed Jennings under the arm, half carrying him as they pushed through a hail of gunfire. Jennings gritted his teeth, refusing to let go of his rifle, firing one-handed at the figures rushing down the slope. Blood streaked his face, but there was fire in his eyes. "I'm not dying here, Sarge," he barked. "Damn right you're not," McKenna growled, hauling him upward. By the time they reached the midpoint of the slope, the platoon was scattered into small groups, each fighting to carve out breathing room against the onslaught. Hale signaled for them to consolidate, waving his good arm as bullets cracked around him. "Form up here," he bellowed. McKenna and Diaz dragged Jennings into cover behind a jet of rock, their rifles answering the steady stream of fire from above. The Apache roared past, its spotlight cutting through the haze, painting the slope in stark light and shadow. Viper's voice broke through the comms again, crisp and steady. "I see you. Hold that position. I'll clean the ridge." A heartbeat later, her gunship unleashed hell. The chain gun rattled in controlled bursts, walking fire across the upper ledges, shredding the enemy like paper. Missiles slammed into deeper positions, turning strongholds into collapsing infernos. The entire ridgeline lit up, flames licking the night sky as the shockwaves echoed down the canyon. For a moment, it felt like the world itself was tearing apart. The platoon huddled close, shielding themselves from falling debris as the Apache's assault reshaped the battlefield. The enemy who moments before had pressed so confidently now screamed in disarray, their formations shattered, their courage buckling under the relentless storm from above. McKenna peeked out from cover, his chest heaving, eyes wide at the devastation unfolding. "She's not giving them a chance to breathe," he muttered, almost in awe. Diaz smirked grimly, sweat streaming down his face. "Good. Neither did they." Jennings, barely conscious, managed a weak grin. "That's one hell of a guardian angel we've got." McKenna didn't reply, but in his heart he agreed. Without Viper they'd already be corpses littering the valley floor. With her, they were alive, and still fighting. When the dust settled, the ridgeline above was a burning ruin. Smoke curled into the night sky, carrying the acrid stench of scorched earth and flesh. Silence fell again, heavy and unsettling, broken only by the crackle of flames. Hale stood tall despite the blood dripping from his sleeve, surveying the slope with cold determination. "We hold here," he said firmly, voice leaving no room for doubt. "This is where we stop them. No more retreat. No more running." His words cut through the silence like a blade, and the men straightened, their exhaustion drowned by grim resolve. McKenna tightened his grip on his rifle, eyes scanning the smoldering horizon. He knew the enemy wasn't gone. Somewhere beyond the flames and shadows, more fighters would be gathering, preparing to throw themselves at the Americans again. But now, with the high ground under their boots and Viper's Apache above, the platoon wasn't prey anymore. They were ready to strike back. The high ground gave them breathing room, but it also made them a beacon. From their perch halfway up the eastern slope, the platoon could see the valley stretching into darkness, a jagged wound lit by flickering fires. The smell of burning fuel and charred stone carried on the wind, mixing with the copper tang of blood. McKenna crouched behind the broken rock wall that served as their makeshift barricade, eyes sweeping the horizon. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He knew the enemy wasn't finished. They hadn't committed everything yet. They were waiting, watching, trying to measure the Americans' resolve. Hale leaned beside him, his bandaged arm hanging limp at his side, but his eyes sharp as ever. "They're regrouping," he muttered. McKenna nodded, watching faint movement in the shadows far below. Tiny specks of light flickered in the distance. Torches or maybe the glow of cigarettes, enemy fighters gathering for another push. They hadn't retreated. They were preparing for something bigger. The Apache still circled above, its rotors pounding the night air like a relentless drumbeat. Its spotlight occasionally swept across the canyon, piercing the smoke, keeping the enemy pinned in uncertainty. But even Viper couldn't fight forever. The gunship's ammunition wasn't infinite and fuel was finite. McKenna knew it and he suspected she did too. The enemy knew as well. All they had to do was endure, force her to burn through her arsenal, then swarm what remained of the platoon. McKenna chewed the inside of his cheek, tasting blood. They were alive because of that machine, but they couldn't rely on it alone. Hale seemed to read his thoughts. "We make a stand here," he said firmly, scanning the men who crouched in the shadows of broken stone. "No more falling back. If they want this ground, they'll bleed for every inch." The soldiers nodded, their faces drawn and pale but their resolve hardening. They had nowhere else to go. The first test came minutes later. A sudden burst of gunfire echoed from the western ridge, sharp and furious. Tracers streaked across the valley, forcing the platoon to duck. Shadows poured out from the canyon floor, dozens of fighters charging uphill, their shouts rising in a war cry that made the night itself seem to tremble. McKenna rose, rifle steady, squeezing off controlled bursts. Enemy silhouettes stumbled and fell, but more surged forward, scrambling up the slope with reckless determination. "Hold the line." Hale's voice cut through the chaos. The platoon answered with fire, rifles cracking, muzzle flashes lighting their faces. Grenades arced through the air, exploding with deafening roars that sent dirt and bodies flying. The enemy staggered but pressed on, climbing over their dead, trying to close the distance. Then the Apache screamed low, its cannon opening up with savage precision. The charging wave crumbled, bodies shredded into dust and smoke. The survivors scattered, scrambling for cover, but the message was clear: this was only the beginning. McKenna slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, his hands moving on instinct despite the tremor of fatigue. Jennings, pale and weak, still managed to fire from his prone position. Diaz crouched beside him to reload his weapon when his hands shook too much. "They're probing us," McKenna said, his voice grim. "Testing our defenses." Hale didn't disagree. He pointed toward the far cliffs, where more shadows were gathering, larger this time, organized. "That wasn't their main push. That was bait." McKenna cursed under his breath. If that had been bait, then the real strike was coming soon and it would hit like a hammer. He glanced up at the Apache, watching as it banked wide across the canyon. For all its power, it couldn't be everywhere at once. If the enemy came from multiple angles, the platoon would be stretched thin. They had to be ready for a storm. The storm came an hour later. It began with silence. No shouting, no gunfire, only the faint hiss of wind through the canyon. The men waited, tense, rifles gripped, ears straining for the first sign. Then the night erupted. From 3 directions at once, the enemy surged forward, their cries echoing in unison. Gunfire exploded from above and below, bullets sparking against stone, grenades bursting among the Americans' defenses. McKenna roared orders, firing until his rifle overheated, then switching to his sidearm as the enemy pressed closer. Jennings screamed as another burst grazed his arm, Diaz dragging him further back behind cover while firing wildly. Hale stood tall in the chaos, rallying the men, his voice hoarse but unbroken. "Hold. Hold, damn it." The platoon fought like cornered wolves, every shot desperate, every inch of ground contested. The slope became a furnace of noise and fire, a battlefield where seconds stretched into eternity. Just as it seemed the line would break, the Apache dove into the chaos once more. Viper's chain guns spat fury, stitching lines of fire through the enemy ranks. Missiles streaked into the canyon, blasting apart clusters of fighters trying to flank the Americans. The ground shook with every strike, the air filled with dust and flame. The enemy broke under the onslaught, their cries turning from fury to terror. They scattered, fleeing into the shadows, leaving behind only the dead and dying. The valley fell silent again, save for the groans of the wounded and the low thrum of rotor blades. The platoon sagged in exhaustion, weapons lowered, their bodies trembling. McKenna collapsed against the stone, chest heaving, ears ringing from the thunder of battle. They had held but barely. And still he knew it wasn't over. The enemy had thrown wave after wave and failed, but that only meant they would return with something worse. Hale moved among the men, clapping shoulders, offering words of steel despite his own pale face. "You held," he told them. "You stood your ground. Remember that." His voice carried weight, even over the lingering echoes of destruction. McKenna looked up at the Apache hovering above, its silhouette a dark guardian against the smoke-streaked sky. Viper's voice came over the comms again, calm and unshaken. "You're holding, but they're not done. More movement beyond the ridge. Bigger group. Stay ready." Her words sent a chill down McKenna's spine. He tightened his grip on his rifle, forcing strength into his tired limbs. The enemy wasn't finished, but neither were they. Not while she was in the sky. Not while the platoon still drew breath. The valley would demand blood before the night was over, but McKenna swore it wouldn't be theirs. The valley was alive with tension, the smoke from destroyed positions twisting like serpents into the night sky. McKenna crouched behind a fractured boulder, rifle ready, muscles screaming from exhaustion, but his eyes never left the distant shadows where the enemy was gathering again. Hale had pulled the platoon tight along the slope, every soldier gripping their weapon as if it were the only thing between life and death. The high ground gave them some advantage, but the enemy's persistence was terrifying. They had regrouped after every wave, returning with fresh fighters and heavier weapons, and now McKenna could see the glint of explosives strapped to the attackers' chests. suicide charges meant to break the Americans' hold. He swallowed hard, forcing his hands steady. There was no room for fear. If panic took hold now, they would be slaughtered. Above, the Apache droned like a dark angel of war, circling low over the canyon, its engines a constant roar. The spotlight swept across the valley, searching for the enemy like the gaze of a predator. Viper's voice came crisp through the comms, calm as always. They're moving faster. 2 groups converging on your position. I'll hit the closest first. Cover each other. McKenna's heart thumped, adrenaline flooding his system. He barked orders to the platoon. Focus on the one coming up the left. Fire in controlled bursts, don't waste ammo. The soldiers obeyed, reloading frantically as the first wave surged upward, shadows crawling like insects along the rocky slope. Muzzle flashes erupted, bullets tore through the night, and McKenna fired until his arms burned. He caught sight of Jennings staggering, blood streaming down his side, yet still returning fire with sheer determination. McKenna's throat went dry. "Kid, you're insane," he shouted, but Jennings only grinned fiercely as though pain itself couldn't touch him. The first wave collided with the platoon's defenses, screams and gunfire blending into a deafening symphony. Grenades exploded, rocks and dust flying in every direction. Hale's voice cut through, sharp and commanding. "Hold. Don't let them break the line." The soldiers tightened their formation, firing with deadly precision, taking advantage of every shadow, every jagged stone. McKenna's heart pounded as he fired his last rounds, tossing the empty magazines aside and grabbing new ones. The attackers kept coming, but the slope's narrowness worked to the Americans' favor. Only so many could advance at once, and each one faced a wall of disciplined fire. The Apache strafed the enemy's positions, and McKenna felt a surge of relief every time the Hellfire missiles struck with surgical accuracy. The valley trembled, and enemy bodies were sent tumbling down jagged cliffs, the earth itself seeming to rise against them. Even as the enemy faltered, McKenna noticed something troubling. The larger group, hidden in the far shadows of the ridge, began converging, circling around to flank the platoon. Hale saw it too. "They're trying to pin us from behind." "Don't let them," he shouted, and the soldiers pivoted, opening fire on the advancing shadows. The firefight intensified, bullets striking rock and tearing through foliage, the air thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. McKenna's ears rang and his hands shook, but his mind was sharp, laser-focused. Every enemy figure that emerged was met with fire, every advance calculated. The slope was chaos, yet strangely controlled chaos. Viper above made it worse for the attackers, appearing suddenly in bursts of gunfire, forcing the enemy to scatter and regroup repeatedly. McKenna realized how crucial her presence was. Without it, they would already have been overrun. Suddenly, a blast erupted near McKenna's flank. A suicide charge had been thrown, its fuse igniting just meters from their position. He dove forward, shoving Jennings out of the blast radius, and the explosion shook the slope, hurling dirt and rock over them. McKenna's ears burned and his body was jolted violently, but he rolled to his feet, adrenaline overpowering pain. Hale was beside him, his face streaked with blood but unwavering. "Keep moving. Don't let them pin you." McKenna's heart raced as he realized the attackers were growing desperate. They had already lost dozens, maybe hundreds, and yet they pressed on, convinced they could force the Americans into surrender. But the Apache wasn't done. Viper swooped low again, chain gun rattling, missiles tearing into the enemy from multiple angles. Explosions lit the slope like a wildfire, bodies flung into the air, and the attackers' morale began to crack. The platoon advanced further up the slope, inching toward a jagged cliff that offered a natural fortress. Every foot of movement was a struggle. The path was slick with debris, smoke burned their lungs, and the screams of wounded men filled the air. McKenna helped pull Jennings along, keeping his rifle trained on the enemies below. Diaz was beside them, his face smeared with grime and blood, firing rapidly, each shot finding a mark. "We're almost there," McKenna muttered, his voice hoarse. "Hold it together. One more push." Hale signaled for covering fire, and the soldiers opened a synchronized barrage, keeping the enemy pinned long enough for the platoon to reach the cliff's edge. The Apache roared overhead, keeping Viper's spotlight trained on enemy regrouping points, forcing the attackers into the open and giving the Americans precious seconds of respite. When they reached the cliff, McKenna finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. The ridge offered a commanding view of the valley below, bodies strewn across the rocky floor, smoke curling into the night sky. The enemy was still moving, still attempting to regroup, but they were disorganized, their momentum shattered. Hale waved the platoon together, their exhaustion evident, but their resolve unbroken. "We've bought ourselves time," he said, voice low but firm. "But they'll try again. Stay sharp. Watch every movement. Don't give them an inch." McKenna looked up at the Apache, the gunship hovering like a dark sentinel above the valley, and felt a surge of gratitude and awe. Viper's presence had saved them multiple times tonight. Without her, the valley would already be littered with the dead. With her, they had a chance, a slim, hard-fought chance, to survive until reinforcements could arrive. And McKenna knew with absolute certainty that no matter what came next, they would fight with everything they had. The ridge was a fragile sanctuary, perched above a valley that had become a furnace of destruction. McKenna crouched behind the jagged rocks, rifle resting on his knees as he tried to calm his racing heart. The men around him were battered and bloodied, their faces smeared with grime, sweat, and the red stain of combat. Every breath was heavy with smoke, dust, and the metallic tang of fear turned into determination. Hale moved among them like a specter of command, checking wounds, shouting orders, and keeping the platoon in line despite the chaos. "They're regrouping," Hale warned, pointing to the distant shadows flickering with faint torchlight. "Don't let your guard down for a second. They'll try everything to take this position." McKenna nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing on him, but he knew better than to let it show. The enemy had tested their limits repeatedly, and each time they had survived, but there was no room for hesitation now. The Apache droned overhead, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and sending echoes of thunder through the canyon. Viper's presence was more than reassurance. It was an impenetrable shield, a moving wall of death that forced the enemy to rethink every movement. She swooped low, cannon spitting fire across the valley floor, missiles carving through enemy positions with terrifying precision. McKenna watched as entire groups of attackers were obliterated in seconds, their formations collapsing under the weight of the gunship's assault. Yet, despite the devastation, the enemy's determination never faltered. They had already lost dozens of men tonight, and still they pressed forward, their desperation transforming into a frenzied courage that was as dangerous as their firepower. McKenna reloaded his rifle, teeth clenched, eyes locked on the shadows moving along the cliffs. This fight was far from over. A sudden flare from the western ridge caught McKenna's attention. A small team of enemy fighters had managed to flank the platoon, moving swiftly and silently, seeking to exploit any weakness. Hale noticed it at the same moment, shouting a warning to the men. McKenna pivoted, firing controlled bursts to intercept the advancing threat. Bullets struck rock and dirt around him, sparks flying as the enemy scrambled to find cover. The flanking force was fast and coordinated, but the platoon's training and determination held firm. Diaz hurled a grenade, the explosion throwing enemy combatants off balance, buying crucial seconds. Jennings, still pale and battered, managed to land 2 shots before stumbling, a faint smile on his bloodied face. "We're not done yet," he whispered, and McKenna grunted in agreement, hauling him back behind the safety of the rocks. Every second counted. Every shot could mean survival. The main enemy force, still disorganized from Viper's relentless assault, began to converge once more, pushing from multiple angles. McKenna's ears rang from the roar of gunfire, explosions, and the whine of RPGs streaking overhead. The Apache swooped in again, strafing the advancing enemy, turning their charge into chaos. Viper's chain gun cut down those who dared to climb the slope, while missiles struck fortified positions, leaving nothing standing. The platoon pressed their advantage, firing with precision, coordinating movements that were instinctual yet flawless under the duress of combat. McKenna ducked as debris from a nearby explosion sprayed across his face, grit stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop firing. Survival demanded it. Every inch of the slope was contested, every breath a gift of defiance against the enemy's fury. Then came the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery, a convoy moving along the upper cliffs, enemy reinforcements bringing mortars, RPGs, and automatic weapons into position. McKenna froze for a fraction of a second, the realization sinking in. If they weren't stopped now, the valley would be engulfed again and the platoon would be crushed. Hale's eyes hardened. "Hold this line no matter what," he ordered. "No falling back. We fight to the last bullet." McKenna's muscles tensed as he scanned the slope, identifying enemy positions, calculating angles, movements, and timing. There was no room for error. The Apache was their shield, but it couldn't protect them from everything. Coordination between ground and air was critical, and McKenna felt the weight of that responsibility on every fiber of his being. Viper responded instantly, adjusting her position, banking low along the ridgeline. Her cannon roared to life, cutting through enemy ranks with mechanical precision. Missiles streaked down to the valley floor, obliterating enemy machinery and scattering combatants into smoke and fire. McKenna and his men followed suit, their rifles cutting down those who survived the initial strike. The air vibrated with explosions, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and the night was alive with destruction and determination. Every pulse of gunfire, every burst from the Apache, every scream and shout carved the rhythm of survival into their bones. They were alive but only because of the coordination, the courage, and the unyielding firepower above. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as the battle raged. The enemy tried again and again, their numbers and strategies evolving, but each attempt was met with calculated resistance. McKenna's body screamed in protest with every movement, fatigue threatening to steal his focus, but his mind refused to yield. Hale moved among the men, shouting encouragement, adjusting positions, treating wounds, and instilling calm in the chaos. The high ground offered them tactical advantage, but survival depended on discipline and resolve. The Apache continued its relentless assault, forcing the enemy into retreat with precision strikes, but McKenna knew that the night wasn't over. The enemy would regroup and the final wave would be coming, heavier, smarter, and deadlier. They had survived so far, but the real test was still ahead. McKenna glanced at the men around him, their faces streaked with grime and blood, eyes blazing with determination despite exhaustion. Viper's Apache circled above, a dark guardian of fire and steel, and for the first time since the ambush began, McKenna felt something close to hope. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and battered, but they were alive. For now. The enemy would return and the valley would demand a price, but the platoon had proven something vital tonight. Courage, discipline, and the presence of an unstoppable force could turn despair into survival. McKenna gritted his teeth, gripping his rifle. "We're not done," he whispered, voice barely audible over the roar above. Not by a long shot. The night hung heavy over the valley, smoke curling in eerie tendrils above the jagged landscape. McKenna crouched behind a fractured boulder, rifle clutched tightly in his hands, the sweat and grime on his face stinging his eyes. Every sound, the whisper of wind, the distant echo of footsteps, the low hum of the Apache overhead, was magnified in the tense silence between waves of combat. Hale moved along the ridge, eyes sharp, body tense despite the blood that smeared his uniform. The platoon was battered, exhausted, and ragged, but every man still carried his weapon, every soldier still burned with the will to survive. "They'll come again," Hale warned quietly. "We've bought time, but this isn't over. Stay sharp." McKenna nodded, scanning the valley below where shadows shifted and flickered. The enemy had already proven relentless. Now they would strike with everything left, desperate to crush the Americans who defied them. Viper's Apache circled above like a dark specter, its blades carving through the night air, sending waves of rotor wash across the ridge. McKenna felt the vibration under his boots, the sheer presence of the gunship a psychological wall that pressed against the enemy's resolve. "They're trying to lure us into exhaustion." Viper's voice came calm and unwavering over the comms. "Watch your left flank. Another group is moving toward your position. I'll handle the ones on the ridge." McKenna barked orders to the platoon, voice hoarse from hours of shouting. "Left side. Watch your angles. Fire in controlled bursts. Don't waste ammo." The soldiers adjusted quickly, their training kicking in despite fatigue. Tracers arced through the night, lighting the shadows, while explosions from the Apache's cannon turned enemy positions into clouds of fire and smoke. Every strike, every shot bought precious seconds of life. Then, with horrifying precision, the enemy attacked from both flanks simultaneously. Figures moved swiftly along the western slope, rifles firing in short bursts, while another wave advanced from a hidden gully below. McKenna fired until his arms burned, picking targets with deadly intent. Diaz shouted, tossing grenades that exploded in arcs of dirt and flame, buying the men space to adjust. Jennings, grimacing with pain, kept firing from his prone position, eyes focused on the advancing enemy. "We're not going down tonight," he yelled, and McKenna felt a surge of pride and fear simultaneously. Every man here was fighting for survival, for each other, for the slim hope that the night could be conquered. The slope became a furnace of chaos, smoke, and fire, with every explosion shaking the men's resolve yet hardening their determination. Viper swooped in low, her Apache weaving through the valley like a phantom. The chain gun rattled in bursts, cutting down enemy clusters with mechanical precision. Missiles streaked across the sky, detonating against fortified positions, throwing debris and bodies in every direction. The roar of explosions echoed through the canyon walls, bouncing back at the soldiers like a constant drumbeat of survival. McKenna reloaded, swept his eyes over the battlefield and fired again, each shot finding a mark. Hale shouted encouragement, moving among the men, adjusting their positions, ensuring no one faltered. The platoon was alive because of their discipline and courage, and because of Viper above, the unstoppable force that turned their desperate fight into a battle they could still hope to survive. The enemy regrouped quickly, clearly aware that brute force alone would not win. They began sending suicide charges up the slope, hurling themselves toward the Americans with reckless abandon. McKenna dove as one exploded nearby, dirt and rock raining down over him, ears ringing, vision blurred by dust and smoke. He scrambled to his feet, dragging a wounded soldier with him, firing over his shoulder to keep the attackers at bay. Hale's voice cut sharply, "Hold the line. No ground lost." The soldiers obeyed, their exhaustion overridden by pure will. Each man fought not just for survival but for each other, their bonds forged in fire and blood. The slope was a crucible, and they were the molten core, burning with defiance against every wave that tried to consume them. Then came the unmistakable thrum of engines, heavier than before. McKenna's stomach sank. Reinforcements? Or a larger enemy unit arriving to overwhelm them? Hale didn't hesitate. "Stay alert. This is it. Everything they've got is coming." The men braced, rifles raised, hearts pounding. Viper banked the Apache low, her spotlight cutting through the smoke, illuminating the valley like a blade of fire. The chain gun roared, missiles streaking downward, turning the enemy into shadows that collapsed into flame. McKenna and the platoon unleashed everything they had, rifles spitting fire, grenades exploding, bodies thrown back by shockwaves. The valley had become a theater of destruction, where survival depended on precision, timing, and unyielding courage. Every second felt eternal, every heartbeat a test of endurance. Hours stretched as enemy after enemy pressed the assault, but the Americans held. McKenna's muscles screamed, his lungs burned, but he refused to let himself falter. Hale moved like a sentinel, correcting positions, rallying soldiers, keeping the line firm. The Apache continued its relentless strike from above, punishing the enemy with surgical precision. Slowly the tide began to turn. The enemy's waves thinned, their attacks losing coordination, desperation seeping into every movement. The valley that had once been a death trap for the platoon now bore witness to their unbroken resolve. McKenna, bloodied, bruised, and exhausted, allowed himself a fraction of relief. They had survived the penultimate wave. The final storm was approaching, but with Hale, his men, and Viper above, they were ready. The night had transformed into a war zone of shattered rock, fire, and smoke, yet atop the ridge McKenna and his platoon held their ground. Every man was exhausted, their bodies battered and bloodied, but their spirits were unbroken. The valley below was strewn with debris, broken enemy lines, and the faint glow of fires consuming ruined positions. Hale moved among them, checking wounds, offering quiet words of encouragement, and keeping the men alert. "This is it," he murmured, his voice low but firm. "The final push. We survive this or—" He left the threat hanging, unnecessary. Everyone knew what was at stake. McKenna tightened his grip on his rifle, glancing at the Apache hovering above, its rotors cutting through the night air like blades. Viper's presence was more than protection, it was the difference between life and death. Tonight it had been everything they had. The enemy had retreated temporarily, regrouping for one final assault. Their numbers were difficult to estimate, but McKenna knew from the rhythm of their attacks that this wave would be the largest yet. Viper's voice crackled over the comms, calm as ever. "They're moving fast. This is their last attempt. Hold tight. I'll break their momentum." McKenna nodded, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Hale spread the men out, ensuring overlapping fields of fire, reinforcing positions with every scrap of cover available. The platoon's resolve was forged now. They knew what they had to do, and they had already seen death close enough to touch. There was no hesitation left, only calculated action, firepower, and determination. The first signs of the final wave appeared on the far ridge. Shadowy figures surged forward, moving with brutal coordination, armed with rifles, RPGs, and suicide charges. The valley seemed to hold its breath as McKenna fired the first shots, his rifle spitting fire into the advancing enemy. Diaz lobbed grenades, the explosions throwing attackers off balance, while Jennings, bloodied but fierce, continued firing with precision. Hale's voice cut through the chaos, commanding, rallying, reminding them of the importance of every shot, every movement. The slope erupted into chaos once more, bullets streaking through smoke, grenades detonating, rocks tumbling under the shockwaves. The enemy pressed, desperate to break the Americans' line, but the platoon's training and discipline turned desperation into slaughter. Above it all, the Apache dove into action. Viper maneuvered with terrifying skill, swooping low, strafing the enemy's formations with the chain gun, missiles streaking down to obliterate fortified positions. Every strike was perfect, calculated, and devastating. The enemy's momentum faltered under the relentless barrage, their ranks breaking in confusion and terror. McKenna found himself moving instinctively with the rhythm of the battle, firing, reloading, assisting the wounded, each action synchronized with the explosions and gunfire orchestrated above. The combination of ground resistance and aerial dominance transformed what seemed like inevitable defeat into a brutal ballet of survival and counterattack. Then, a group of enemy fighters charged with explosives strapped to their chests, aiming directly for the ridge's defenses. McKenna dove as one detonated near Diaz, the shockwave throwing him off his feet. Hale shouted commands, directing fire, while McKenna dragged Diaz to cover, firing his sidearm at approaching threats. Jennings, weakened from previous injuries, crawled forward, tossing grenades, his every movement a defiance of the physical pain that threatened to immobilize him. Viper's Apache roared overhead, chains of gunfire stitching through the enemy's assault, missiles tearing apart the ground where the attackers had surged. In minutes that felt like hours, the assault collapsed, the attackers either dead or fleeing into the shadows. But the final strike was yet to come. A massive formation of enemy fighters, armored and determined, began moving from the eastern cliffs, their advance coordinated and relentless. Hale shouted, "Positions! Hold fast! We end this now!" McKenna's muscles screamed, his body near exhaustion, but adrenaline and sheer will carried him forward. The platoon unleashed everything they had, rifles, grenades, and last rounds, cutting down the first ranks of the attackers. The Apache swooped low again, cannon blazing, missiles tracking targets with lethal precision. The enemy formation began to fracture, their momentum broken, their morale shattered by the combined firepower and unyielding determination of the defenders. As the last of the enemy forces retreated into the darkness, silence slowly returned to the valley. Smoke drifted across the battlefield, mingling with the faint smell of gunpowder and scorched earth. The platoon, exhausted and bloodied, stood atop the ridge, their weapons still raised, eyes scanning for threats that no longer came. Hale moved among the men, nodding, offering quiet words of acknowledgement and pride. McKenna sank against a rock, chest heaving, legs trembling, and allowed himself a long, shuddering breath. The Apache hovered above one last time, Viper's voice calm and steady over the comms. "You held it. The valley is yours tonight. Stay sharp until extraction." McKenna nodded, relief washing over him in waves. They had survived, against impossible odds, surrounded, outnumbered, yet undefeated. The first light of dawn began to creep over the canyon's edge, illuminating the devastation, the bodies, and the scars carved into the landscape by the night's battle. The soldiers looked out over the valley, battered but alive, their eyes reflecting exhaustion, awe, and a fierce pride. McKenna's gaze rose to the Apache one last time, the silhouette of Viper's gunship cutting against the pink horizon. Without her they would have been crushed, but with her they had survived. Hale clapped McKenna on the shoulder. "You fought like hell. Every one of you did. Remember this." McKenna nodded, finally allowing a tired smile. The valley had tested them, threatened to break them, yet they had endured. The night was over. They had survived. The end.